Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the new season of Exchange Talks. Yay! Our first one this season is to be given by Jacquelyn Hazle here, and it's entitled Opera's Search for a Witness, a composer-librettist's Perspective. And here's a little bit about Jacquelyn. American-born composer Jacquelyn Hazle writes for numerous and ever-expanding forces, for solo, chamber, orchestral and vocal repertoire. She is a performer, composer and educator who has collaborated with top new music performers, including Kevin Bowyer, John McDonald, the Gaia Duo, and members of Sound Icon and Red Note ensembles. Her music is featured in the Plug New Music Festival and won the 2018 Berklee College of Music's Contemporary Compositions Award. Fascinated by the stories and lives of people, Jacquelyn's compositions pursue new topographies for human and musical expressivity. Her vocal work explores the fringes of compositional conventions, renegotiating the composer's relationship with the written word. In 2021, Jacquelyn successfully designed and debuted her novel vocal form, the Loquat. She has written her own texts for solo voice, choir and opera. Jacquelyn is a PhD candidate in composition at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland under the supervision of Dr. Stuart McRae and Dr. Michael Ferguson. She holds an MA in music from Tufts University and a BM summa cum laude in composition from Berklee College of Music. She is also a member of the City of Glasgow Chorus. Please welcome Jacquelyn Hazle.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone for being here. I know there's always something to do on a Monday night, so I appreciate your time being here this evening. It's really a privilege to be speaking here with you for the first Exchange Talk series of the season. As a composer, I'll be sharing my work in writing and developing my opera, The Witnesses, from a practice as research perspective. I hope to share some insights I have found through my work by discussing my compositional methods in creating the words and music for my opera, and in doing so, argue that composers can write good operas and libretti, not necessarily prove that they do, or that I am. So composers are generally a multifaceted music professional whose jobs extend beyond just the craft of writing music. These are just a couple examples of roles that they might undertake. However, the role of the creative writer isn't generally one that the composer occupies. Writing and analyzing vocal text isn't a normal part of most composition curricula the way writing or analyzing scores is. Writing one's own text can be seen as a taboo amongst composers. Anecdotally speaking, in my own experience, both between the United States and here in the United Kingdom, I encountered a fair amount of rather negative rhetoric around composers who would write their own text, who are often described as some homogenized group that were arrogant, brazen, or even self-indulgent. As the composer-librettist for my opera, I have to be aware that while my work does have precedent, it is unconventional. So how did I get into text and libretto writing, and why would I? So in reality, it was quite a reactionary development that became a means to an end. It was never really an artistic endeavor for its own sake. In 2020, when I was working on my master's, there seemed to be these American political tensions that were just increasing and culminating. For, I'll say the sake of scope, but also for the sake of sanity retention, I'll not delve into that. There was also, of course, the small matter of the 2020 and 21 coronavirus pandemic and lockdowns. So with all of the flurry of stress, tension, sorrow, anger that seemed to be occupied in conversations happening around me, my own reaction to it was a sense of inadequacy to respond to it that put a bit of an urge in me to engage more deeply with what I was saying in music. If I was going to say something in my composition, I might as well think intentfully about it. It became a bit of a subconscious moral obligation. This led to my trying to write text for some of my vocal music, which also gave way to engaging more deeply with the composition practice itself. I then developed the loqua form and genre and debuted it as part of my master's thesis. I composed loquas number 1 and 2, as well as the art song for tenor and piano, Does Wax Not Soon Cool? So there are definitely benefits and compromises to writing a libretto, and I'll clarify the libretto is the text or the script for the opera, coming from the Italian term for a little book. So in writing my own libretto, I do get increased autonomy and control over my opera, as well as the librettist portion of the copyrights. And I get to more freely adapt the words to my music, whereas normally that would be a negotiated role. And I also get to take more musical approaches to crafting the words. However, things that I'm aware I'm not quite able to access by not having a separate librettist is a sense of assurance in the quality of the art in the words. A librettist is expertised and specialized in the craft of writing words, the way I'm specialized in writing music. There's also the benefits just of collaboration. You get to air your ideas and puts a bit of accountability behind them. By sharing them, you also get to verify whether your ideas make sense or not. Glossing over these lists rather briefly, they're not meant to be comprehensive, they're just a visual idea of what I'm talking about here. So the majority of operas have been written by pairs of composers and librettists. And if we break out of opera into art song, whether it's chanson or lieder, we see the similar trend where most composers set texts previously written by specialized writers. Now, if we look at composer-librettists, not only do we see there's a bit of overlap between librettists and composer-librettists, but there's actually a couple more instances than you might think. So there is precedent for the work that I'm doing in writing my own libretto. It's just not coming from the book of the previous practice. Again, moving over this rather quickly just because this is predominantly a scope for the practice as research model, but I'd be remiss if I didn't at least glimpse into a couple of background contexts here. If we look at Giancarlo Menotti, he's written numerous operas, 25 operas, though very few are performed. Key example being The Consul, which was received very well in its initial reception, had a great performance standing when it came out initially, but has moved into a rather questionable status, and even Menotti himself isn't always the most popular or readily received of composers. Now, if we look at Arrigo Boito, the librettist for Verdi, he also has this dynamic of his operas shifting in reception over time. His very first opera, Mefistofele, which precedes his work with Verdi, received scandalous, premiere, but then actually came through some 20th century revivals. He would then go on to work extensively with Verdi and others, and his final opera, which premiered posthumously, did have a decent reception, but is rarely performed now. So this raises questions around how we judge operas and librettists, and therefore composer-librettists. If something can shift and evolve over time, what does that mean around a rhetoric behind composer-librettists? There is a bit of gap in some of the literature and research in a few of these areas that I think there could be more room for development and inquiry. There really is no consensus amongst composers on how to evaluate libretti. Like I said, it's not a traditional part of the curricula. And a little more examination into the rhetoric or value judgments where we composers get it from, as well as just the evolution of popularity of any given opera or opera writer over time, could elucidate a lot of these dynamics. So when am I trying to create? When I'm creating a libretto. Some of the elements that I perceived and tried to work with are language, drama, and the overall purpose or goal. So any of these elements can be found in different operas, poetic, prosaic language, or more speech-like language, drama that's more of the verismo style that mimics real life, or historical, fantastical, fictional, surreal, so on. But we can also ask questions about what should a libretto do? Should it challenge us to reflect on our lives, or should it give us repose? Should the words be in service to music, or vice versa? For my own libretto for the witnesses, I tried to concentrate on more or less these elements in different degrees, and I'll explain them a bit more as we go. But these are essentially the components that I'm working with, and I'll say that my aim was to create a story that would be a little bit provocative, that would challenge us to reflect on some key elements, though not necessarily controversial. Again, more specifically speaking, these are some of the aspects involved in my libretto, and I'll cover each of these in different degrees, more directly or indirectly in some cases. But this is more or less what we'll be looking at as we go forward. So, the obvious question, what is The Witnesses about? It's a 2-act tragedy in 11 scenes. It's set in modern English, approximately 90 minutes long. It's set in a small town of an unspecified location, in an unspecified but probably contemporary time period. So by unspecified location, I didn't want it to get locked into an American locality or a British locality. I actually wanted that to be open to whoever in theory might perform it, and to make room for that kind of linguistic or accent work. And that also opened up interesting doors when crafting the language as well. I say unspecified but probably contemporary time period simply because there is a reference to a car, there's a female cop, and there are educated women, so there are time periods it would be harder to set this opera in. So, I use a combination of vernacular and speech-like language, as well as prosaic, stylized, poetic language, though I will kind of move through them somewhat nebulously at times. I do follow a rather traditional operatic structure that makes use of recitativo and arioso materials, but again, it can move a bit nebulously between the two types of segments. So the opera is about martyrdom, but it's not exclusively about death or morbidity or darkness. It really is about a search for a particular kind of hope that is so certain it can withstand certain harsh trials. The word martyrdom and martyr comes from the Greek word martyria, which means witness, or one who gives witness. This opera is trying to ask and even respond to, attempt to provide answers and thoughts to rather difficult questions, both through the evolution of the plot and dialogue that happens with the characters from within the text. To partially serve this purpose, I conceived of 2 segments that I called the dialogues 1 and 2, where the 2 main characters discuss some of these harder questions, and they break away from plot development to just have dialogue and thought and discourse. So the score and the orchestra calls for a 13-piece orchestra: flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, French horn, trumpet, trombone, 1 percussionist, harp, violin, viola, cello, and bass. There are 7 singers, 2 high coloratura sopranos, 1 lyric soprano, 2 mezzo-sopranos, 1 role that's moved between tenor and bass baritone. You'll hear the tenor version tonight, and 1 baritone. There's also a pre-recorded chorus, standard soprano, alto, tenor, bass with divisi. I can talk about orchestration till kingdom comes, so I'm going to move on, naturally. So, the plot and the character arcs occupy in 2 categories that move in contrasting trajectories. The main characters and the side characters who move from the banal and the mundane into the extreme. The main characters begin from a position of modest, small optimisms and positive outlooks that then grows and expands into more resolute hope, whereas the side characters beginning from a position of rather general cynicism then permeates and extends into malice and even murder. So I'll introduce you to our cast. Our 2 main characters are Maria and August, both of about the same age. Maria is a soprano, a librarian, educated in literature. She is from the town in which the opera is set, and she's generally optimistic and sincerely pious. However, her more positive disposition tends to rub her neighbors the wrong way. August is very well read and intelligent, tends to work odd jobs. He's not originally from the town and moves there. He's a recent arrival. He has no general ill will towards anyone, but he is tormented by the moral ambiguity of his past. These 2 are very strictly not romantic. I'm very explicit about that in all of my synoptic and proposal materials. And it's through a platonic but very strong friendship that these two are able to walk together and accompany one another through their hardships and develop in their own trajectories. So for our side characters, we have Maeve, the high soprano, we have Laura and Lauren, a dual role for the second high soprano, Pippa, mezzo-soprano, Edie, and Daniel. So in devising these side characters, I needed to figure out how exactly they were going to contribute to the main characters in their own development, how they act as antagonists, but also give them unique and strong individual characters. This is where I chose to work with archetypes to give them a starting point where I could craft individual roles, quirks and faults, as well as hardships that would then give them their own unique character, but also help to contribute to what they offer to August and Maria. Just to cover a bit musically what's going on with them, because I've not got any recordings of these folks. So Maeve, Laura, and Lauren use a lot of high-flowing coloratura as well as sharp angular leaps to convey their characters, a bit different for each person. Pippa, being rather immature, uses animated and unstable music, but she also has rather sharp punctuated rhythms or sliding glyphs to convey her mockery and scorn, a bit of a young valley girl type, if you will. Edie and Daniel are both rather holier than thou in their attitudes, so I use a bit of semi-classical Mozartian style music to convey a sense of pompousness, but I also use their lower ranges and tessituras to evoke some lower tones where their bitterness and seethingness can come through. Then finally there's the chorus of martyrs and saints. These are the multitudes of a heavenly body that sing in spirit with August. It's a pre-recorded chorus. They're not physically present on stage, but they're clearly sharing space with him. They occur in just one scene, and their music and their text is all about demonstrating a sense of confidence and assuredness for the reward of those who choose love over malice, while sharing concern for those who choose malice over love. Their music is loud and jubilant, rejoicing, so it sets a different tone on a text that conveys that sense of concern for those who might have caused them these gruesome deaths, potentially. Thanks to the acoustic richness of the human voice, almost any interval can sound very rich and full. With this chorus, I went with a lot of quartal and quintal harmonies, fourth and fifth structures, to really exaggerate that richness, but also give it a bit of an ethereal, otherworldly sound. So these are just a few of several sources that help to form the language of the opera. I will cover the two literary examples a little bit more, just to cover briefly St. Augustine of Hippo. So he, of course, has his own body of literature and research to delve into, not getting too deep into him. Essentially, his life and his story of conversion was essential in shaping both of the main characters, but especially for August, where he gets his name from, of course. Then there's Father Marcel Uineza, whom I met in 2020. I heard him speak on 2 occasions where he told his story as a survivor of the Rwandan genocide, and thankfully, again, he lived to tell the tale, so I was very fortunate that I got to hear him talk while he was completing his own PhD in theology in Boston, then a second time in New York. In New York, he was also speaking with Father Zachary Baruku, a Benedictine monk, who was speaking on behalf of the 40 young seminarians who were killed in Burundi. And there was Bishop Anba David, who was speaking on behalf of the 21 young men from the Coptic Orthodox faith who were killed in Libya. So these figures all played a role of stimuli behind my reflections on the word witness and martyrdom. It was Bishop David who described the definition of martyria, and that has served quite a heavy impact in how I thought about these concepts and my urge to think about them musically. So now getting into some examples of the libretto and the literary sources. C.S. Lewis, a couple of his works I quite enjoy. The Great Divorce in particular was really useful for thinking about how I would articulate free will beyond just with the actual meat and nitty-gritty of the words in the opera, but it also served as a source of enjoyment, a shared source of enjoyment for the main characters. When they meet, they get to bond over their shared love for different types of literature. I won't read through all of the examples for the libretto I've provided, but they're on screen for you to read at your own leisure. Another literary source that both helped to shape the structure of the libretto, but also became a key plot device within the opera, was La Commedia Divina, or The Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. So this provided me the motif of stars. The 3 series of epic poems ends with the words le stelle, or Italian for the stars. So I use the stars frequently as a motive for hope. It also has the circles of hell, of course, from Inferno, which in the first example in the top half there, you can see a little bit of a reference to. I also drew a little bit more from his technique using a hendecasyllabic or 11-syllable structure and a ternary rhyme scheme, so A, B, A, B, C, B, D, C, D, etc., when crafting a particular scene where they're discussing the source of literature. So you can see a little bit of that example in the bottom where Maeve says, "If God favors cops the same as people do, then I'm off to the 7th circle neck deep in boiling blood, turning violent brutes into stew." Colorful. So I'm a composer, I think with motifs, so of course I had to at times think with words as motifs, which was a useful device that I could fall back onto. It was familiar for me. So in the case of the sidecast, one phrase that comes up frequently is very short and simple: life is rough, conveying their cynicism both towards life in general, but also individually towards any given character. I use the phrases, why pretend to be happy, why pretend to be sad, to help establish their dismissal towards the main characters as well. I use the introductory line at the end of the day, this weighty, all-encompassing phrase, to expand from their cynicism into suspicion and malice, where they have the line, at the end of the day, life loses out to the corpse. Whereas Maria uses that phrase to help reinforce her certainty and conviction of hope, despite her gruesome demise, really. Now I also use the time of the day and skies both as symbols across the structure and the architecture of the opera, as well as for metaphors within the dialogue between August and Maria. So the stars, the night, sun, all of these can be used to convey a sense of optimism or negativity, and where one looks, what one sees underneath these skies, helps to establish their outlook, what they're thinking and feeling. Maria also uses this again to convey her sense of hope at the end of her own life. So, a couple of key sources behind the music now. These are just a couple of operatic examples. Again, not an extensive list, just giving you a bit of a glimpse into the work I've done here. So, Peter Grimes by Benjamin Britten uses a similar orchestration to what I'm using, so that can be a helpful reference to draw from instead of a great big massive Wagnerian or Puccini level orchestra that's not going to translate to something smaller like a 13-piece orchestra. In this case, Peter Grimes also deals with a community's hostility towards an ostracized protagonist and moral ambiguity, so this case also has dramatic benefit as well. Dialogues of the Carmelites by Francis Poulenc also has musical and dramatic benefit here. So there's these rather late romantic sort of emotive musical qualities, lyrical lines and phrases that were more of the character I wanted to evoke in certain cases, but it also discusses a lot of theological discourse and complicated choices that can be made in life, free will, spiritual transcendence. So Marilyn Forever by Gavin Bryars was again an orchestration influence. I got to hear him give a pre-concert talk before Marilyn Forever was performed here at the Conservatoire, and he talked about his interest in an orchestra that uses lower set instruments, or at least opts out of certain higher instruments like the flute and the violin, so to speak. Hearing this, I thought it was interesting, and I was curious, would this sound like it was missing an upper end? Would it sound incomplete or locked in a particular register? But listening to the performance later on, it was clear that just as great of a scope and color and timbre and range could be achieved. So I sometimes try to use that to create certain color effects in my orchestration. So now you get to listen to something other than my voice. Don't worry, I did account for that. So again, I'm a composer. I like to think in terms of motifs. So I use several contrasting opposites in my musical motifs to shape the music, set the text, or shape the text and set the tone, and contextualize plot and character developments. Music has a really immense power to reveal what isn't being said verbally, or to reinforce what is being said. So in these first couple of instances, we have the grief and the hope motif. The grief motif uses a descending minor sixth, frequently in that rhythm, though not always, and it's usually used by August more so than Maria. And we also have the hope motif, which is an ascending major sixth, used in several different rhythms. So I'll play an example of the grief motif and note the rather frail high falsetto in the tenor voice. So now here's another example with the hope motif, and again, hear the rather frail high falsetto that he uses to express his sense of uncertainty in a moment when he's first realizing his potential for redemption.
It's not just redemption at stake here, but resurrection.
So there's a sense of coloring the voice beyond just placing notes to words to voice. Now the scheming motif and the reflection motif are another pair of contrasting motifs. The scheming motif usually accompanies the side characters during or after they've done something rather cruel or unkind to the main characters. It uses these dissonant or unpleasant intervals, whereas the reflection motif follows the same general structure. However, it uses more pleasant and consonant intervals. I'll play two examples so you can hear them in comparison. So in that, that was the scheming motif. Here's the reflection motif.
Is that enough for you?
So in that instance, the reflection motif is helping to transition August and Maria into a more contemplative form of discourse and start to break a little bit away from linear plot development. In this other example, you'll hear the reflection motif happening all around Maria singing. You don't hear quite the layers the same in the piano reduction, but in the score there are multiple instruments that are sharing and crossing over with the motif. So in that instance, the reflection motif is surrounding her and she's making one final argument to August right before he uses the hope motif. Now, I've only got one recording for one of these martyrdom motifs, so I will play that as well. In essence, the first martyrdom motif helps to indicate August and Maria's awareness of their mortality or just foreshadow it, and it helps to convey the gravity of their fates. Yep. Okay, still where we're supposed to be, making sure. And the second martyrdom motif, slightly in contrast, actually helps to represent the peace or sense of transcendence that they feel in juxtaposition to their demise. So I'll play a clip of the first martyrdom motif for you. This is where Maria is essentially summarizing the main point of the opera, but also foreshadowing what's to come. One of the benefits of working with a singer like Rosie Lavery is when you write a line where this motif and this music needs to just be rather bare and exposed, it's also nice to let the voice just sort of ring out, sit and present itself, and the voice can just sit, be present, and you enjoy the beauty of the voice as an instrument as well as the drama of what's happening in the rest of the opera around it. So we'll now watch a short excerpt. It's about 2 minutes long. This is from Act 1, Scene 5, and this is from last year's Master Scene Showcase, which Mark Hathaway here was very generous in allowing me to have programmed. So we have Rosie Lavery, the soprano, as Maria, James Shoughton as the tenor August, and Rebecca Warren as the repetitor. So in this example, you'll hear a combination of the vernacular and prosaic language. You'll hear emotion conveyed through both short punctuating music as well as longer lyrical lines. In this particular moment in the opera, the two are thinking and talking over their harder questions around redemption and remorse. This is a bit of an excerpt from what I called earlier the Dialogues 1.
My actions have consequences. Yes, they do. And our hidden thoughts have implications. Yes, they do. And confessions need to be sincere. Certainly they do. Then how can you say in this life there's redemption for me? Or that a contrite heart is enough to be redeemed? How can you say I could ever change my past? Just because I'm burdened by the guilt that I deserve. I don't mean a past or a cruel act is ever undone by the pain in your heart or remorse in your mind. Like the spark left in your sight, your hand can't remove. Guilt is a longing to be saved, a hand to heal what a darkness had pierced. Your guilt means that deep down you believe too, there is someone to redeem you. Redemption can be asked for. Yes, it's true. And salvation can be given. Yes, it's true. So anyone can live with hope. I really think it's true. Then how can you say in this life that the innocent can hope when they're crushed by the works, by the evil of humanity? How can you say in this life
full high A flat ringing out to just land, right? So I'll touch very briefly on some of the dramatic and musical elements that happened here. Of course, you hear this short back and forth conversation and then these longer, elaborate lines of text. As I said before, these two are meant to be friends, and it's on that basis of their friendship. August can start this conversation, thought, thought, they can go back and forth. So that sort of rapid understanding that kind of occurs between two people who understand each other better, I tried to set in the rhythm and in the music. But I also tried to stay with some of these questions that I wanted to deal with in this opera that August is asking. For example, how can you say that it's even possible I could be redeemed just because I feel guilty? That's a fair question. Why is it that you feel bad for something you've done? Is that really enough for him to believe that there is hope for him after that? But she has to respond to that with something she does believe to be true by saying the fact that you feel guilty proves that there's a need in you. You couldn't need something unless there could be someone else who could give it to you. So they're struggling with these big ideas that I've certainly struggled with, any one of us may have struggled with at any point. And it's not to say these are definitive conclusions, of course, but by just giving them a bit of air and space in the music, I found a way of expressing them and thinking of them that was effective and helpful for me, at least. That's not bad. So, going forward with the witnesses, next steps. Of course, it's to complete the music. The libretto is now done, and I'm actively finishing the music. I'm working on it in two stages. First is to finish a version for 2 singers and piano, and then to finish the full-length opera. I hope to also develop it through some performances. For me, it's not only important to finish the score, but to test out some of the work that I'm doing as a composer-librettist in a public sphere, to give them a little bit more airing to see what happens. I can stand and talk here for about 45 minutes, but the real test of this research comes in a public airing, such as this. So these are some prospective performances I hope to have coming up. Some of these are not quite definitive, but they're ones I'm actively working on establishing. And of course, this is a part of my general PhD submission here at the Conservatoire. So this will play a key role in my commentary and portfolio, which is meant to explore the roles of intentionality and Catholicity within the composition practice. So some concluding remarks. To begin with, composers here, well, I'll preface that just a little bit. I do hope that by revealing just a couple of insights and all of the various things that, well, not all, some of the things I'm thinking of when writing the words, setting up the drama, writing the music, that it's showing there's at least an active potential for composers to function as decent librettists. And I hope some of the very, very light precedent I touched on in previous examples, my precedent, is that with time, with development, a composer can hope to become a good composer-librettist, just like they would a good orchestrator or anything else. It takes time, it takes development. So composers who are open to the necessary learning, time, and experience can become skilled in both crafts of music and words, and they shouldn't feel discouraged from exploring that role of composer-librettist. Now, composers of words and music could also allow new voices, stories, and perspectives to emerge in contemporary vocal and operatic repertoire. Granted, there are structural and economic barriers in place to creating new opera and creating new music, and I've not talked about those. The point I want to make here, because that's truly another kind of worms that can be elucidated in numerous other presentations, undoubtedly. But here we might find a potential creative barrier that we can reduce if we open our minds to the potential for composers to become functional librettists, which might then allow more ideas, more stories to come into the body of works that we have at our disposal. Composers who write their own words must engage more deeply with their extra musical content and become more autonomous and accountable for their own voice. In short, if we need to think more intensively about whatever it is we aspire to write in our music or to express in our music, we might say it more effectively and with more ownership by actually writing it to begin with, instead of taking it from an external source. And in doing so, we might also have a little bit more accountability over it is what we need to say. Like I said, this was a practice as research presentation primarily, so I've not done a full scope of survey or research into composer-librettist work. I've done some searching as part of my own research and in writing this opera, but I found that there were some gaps in the official discourse around the subject. So I do think further research could be done to elucidate some of these factors, like a more comprehensive survey of composer-librettist work, as well as the composer's popularity, how it evolves and changes over time. A comparative analysis of opera's reception at their premiere versus now would also be really informative and help us to understand where we might be getting our rhetoric from when we say if a composer who writes their own text is arrogant, etc. Is that rhetoric just a personal bias? Is it actually founded on a particular assumption based in time? Or is that actually a legitimate trend? We can analyze our own biases and preconceptions if we have some of this more official research to fall back on. I also think performance anxiety and how that manifests for composers could be an interesting source of literature to emerge, as there is plenty of literature around performance anxiety in performers, but not so much in composers. And composers have interesting rhetoric as well around what it means to let a piece go out into the open air. So what that means for the composer-librettist could also be interesting to explore. So just to give a quick recognition to Victoria Wisner, who took the photos you saw earlier on some of those slides and also gave me permission for their use. And these are some of the references. So I'm happy to follow up with anyone who cares to be in touch regarding what you've seen tonight. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Really, my sincerest thanks to Mark Hathaway and to the Research and Knowledge Exchange team for permitting me and inviting me to be here and speaking with you all tonight. It really has been my pleasure and privilege.
Thank you very much, Jackie. That was very interesting. I'm going to open it up now to the floor for some questions, but if you'll forgive me, I've got one of my own to start off with. That's okay. So, Jackie, given the work you've done to this point, do you identify as a writer, composer, librettist, or composer-writer? How do you see yourself at this point?
Thank you. So, I suppose I have to say I'm a composer-librettist because I am the composer-librettist for the witnesses. I think that has interesting implications down the road. What if I never write another opera and it's libretto again? Am I still a composer-librettist just because I've done that work? I think what I identify as now and down the road is an interesting question. And in terms of being a writer, not so much. I think because even though I suppose I could say I'm a composer text writer maybe, but to say that I'm a writer, I don't know if I would quite go that far, just because I'm not writing material to exist outside of the music that I write. So I'm not writing poetry to be poetry. I'm not writing novellas or other forms of creative writing. I'm just writing words to fit the music that I'm writing. So, yeah.
And how difficult do you think it would be to respond to somebody else's words now that you've had control over both of them?
In truth, I actually do want to set other people's text. I've really never been in a position that I wanted to give up on setting other people's text, and there's a lot of text out there. I definitely like more than my own. I have just kind of kept needing to use this particular device for the music at 10. Kind of like I said, it's always been more of a necessary means to an end as opposed to an artistic endeavor I was just excited about. It really was a device that I needed. So I really do want to set other people's texts. I think I've got a handful of poems in my laptop that are just waiting for me to get around to them at some point.
That's great. Any questions from the floor? Yes.
Hi Jackie.
Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm sort of working on a little opera project, and I'd love to get your thoughts on creating roles that are more accessible to a wider type of singer. So something I've been wrestling with was using intersectionality to write the characters and to see what that would mean. I've been trying to engage less and less with the archetypes that are so standard in opera because they're so gendered, and they just carry a lot of sort of social meanings that I really hate. And so I've just been trying to work with working ways that would ensure that, for example, like my friend who's trans could come and sing a role. But yeah, I just wanted to get your thoughts, like as someone who's writing an opera, who's written an opera, how would you go about creating roles that are more accessible? What would you leave out? What would you bring in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you for that. One of the things that wound up being a blessing for me was when I was looking at the roles for the sidecast, they were originally structured thinking towards some of the students here at RCS. Granted, plans changed, of course, but it became really useful because I was not casting the voice types to the roles. So take Pippa, for example, who's a young, immature, rather bratty type. She would have been really easy to reify in a light, high soubrette or high lyric soprano sort of thing. Instead, she's a mezzo-soprano. And because I was thinking about a particular singer who had brought a particular personality to the table, so you don't normally see something like a young, snot-nosed mezzo. That's usually going to be a higher voice type, generally speaking. And the character is quite snot-nosed. So writing the roles for the person as opposed to the voice type was something I thought was kind of helpful in breaking out of some of these barriers. One of the issues that I've always kind of been wrangling with, and I'll share it just because I don't have a full answer, it's still my own thoughts that I'm practicing and working on, and hopefully they're helpful to you. I get anxious about some of the Catholic and theological elements that I put into my work, and I actually meant for a lot of this text to be less overt in that end. But that raises questions of, okay, well, how much do I want to cover it up? How much do I want to secularize it to make it more palatable? Is that repackaging something? Is it taking it and turning it into something else? Or is it taking something and saying it with a sense of honesty and legitimacy, just in a different aesthetic or wearing a different face, if you will? So these are all questions that I don't actually have a really strong answer with, but I do think I felt most successful where it was a most honest artistic gesture and a most honest representation of what it is I mean to say. I keep going back to engaging with the words and the music more deeply because it actually becomes a means to work through some of these issues. I can get to a line of text and go, you know what, that just needs to be overtly what it is, even if it's not as palatable to some folks. So I think it's in your prerogative as the creator to decide where those decisions can be softened down and where it's not really diminishing from the personalities and characters you're working with, where they do just need to be more overt and where they can be a bit softer around the edges if that would make it more palatable. So I think you can make those judgment calls from the position of the extra musical subjects as well as the musical subjects at hand, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're going towards sacrificing your intentionality. Is that right?
Yes and no. Intentionality in a more philosophical understanding isn't just possessing intention. It's the capacity for a thing to be about something. So that's where I refer to a subject as aboutness in some of my other works and research. Because whatever your opera is about, how you talk about that, it's not just your intention, it's the intention of the music, but it's also just what it's about. So an intention is more of a matter of purposiveness, strictly speaking from a phenomenological standpoint, as opposed to intention. So maybe you do need to sacrifice the intention, maybe you don't. Maybe by preserving the subject of aboutness, you're still preserving your intention. Does that more or less make sense?
Thank you.
Any more questions? Yes.
Hi, earlier you mentioned that you're writing text to set to the music that you have already. I was wondering if that you found libretto writing to happen in direct tandem with your musical compositions, or if they were sort of two separate processes, or if there was a sort of order about that.
It's kind of taken a couple of different forms. I didn't start writing the libretto, wait till I finished, and then started writing the music. I kind of had a lot of things mulling in my head for some time before I really sat down and said, okay, I'm writing this opera. And because I had some of this music in there, some of the words actually were already kind of coming out. I also, my own particular composition style is that I'm very, very, very timbre oriented. So I can't hear pitch without timbre. If I hear a melody, I know that's a clarinet. I know that's this type of voice. So I find an interesting thing can happen when ideas are kind of germinating. They'll actually pick the words almost like they pick the timbre. So that clip you heard, it's more or less exactly the music that I heard, although I originally heard it with a bass baritone voice. But the text I had to sort of reconstruct and recreate it. I'm flying from my home to out the door and I hear this music. That's so good, I can't write it down. So that was a place where text writing kind of happened together synonymously with the music writing. But there have also been times where, you know, I've got a great big manuscript tablet paper, and I've also got my notebook for just the text, and I just sat and scribbled out thoughts, penciled them, erased them. So sometimes they happen together, sometimes they happen separately, and then of course sometimes I get around to writing the music and I say I'm scrapping that line, I don't need it, I need to get through this scene faster, I need to keep under 90 minutes.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
More questions?
Thank you so much, Jackie. I was wondering how this piece of work fits into the greater PhD. What is its particular contribution within your PhD context?
So the two key terms behind the subjects for my PhD and commentary are intentionality and Catholicity. So I talk about different types of intentionality that I conceive and different types or manifestations of Catholicity. This is just one example where I can talk about different kinds of each of those subjects. It'll represent what I called proactive intentionality, and how many different forms of Catholicity are involved. There's subject aboutness, there's motivic structures, there's a lot of different forms of Catholicity involved. So this is just kind of a vehicle to explain those subjects a little bit more broadly in comparison to other works, some of which don't have any subject of aboutness at all, they're just a piece of music.
Any more questions? Yes.
So at the beginning you mentioned that you liked, or you wanted to have more control and more autonomy by writing the music and the lyrics, or music and the libretto rather. I was just wondering if there was a point in the process where you felt that you had too much autonomy, and that you thought maybe it would have been like beneficial to have another perspective in form of libretto that you could jump on.
That's more or less what I was thinking when I was talking about the benefits of collaboration. You become too close to the thing that you're creating, and it's just all the more challenging to get distance from it. That's where my supervisor is quite helpful in this matter, very experienced veteran operatic composer who's worked with one particular librettist often. That's very helpful, getting that kind of expertise oversight. And I didn't actually initially set out to write this on my own. I actually did want to find a librettist. Despite my pre-existing work with writing text, I still felt that it was a bit of a move into arrogance actually by writing my libretto. I just couldn't find anyone that was quite in sync or ready to take on this project. And there came a point where the ideas really were culminating and just needed to come out. So I just said, okay, I'm just gonna write this libretto and I'm gonna take text writing to a new notch, for better or worse. But yeah, exactly. There is a point where having that distance and having that collaborative other, that partner, is actually really useful. And I can tell where I'm missing that at times.
That's really interesting, thank you.
We've got time for one more question. Well, I'll just ask you, what's the career trajectory for an opera composer these days? Where does one go after one completes one's PhD?
So you said we had time for one more question. How many answers do we have time for? So
2 minutes.
yeah. There we are. So it's quite complicated. The trajectory for a composer, kind of like I pointed out earlier, you take on many roles. You start wearing all the hats you can manage to wear. You become an educator, maybe a professor or a lecturer. You become a researcher. You take on the roles that you can to establish a career as a composer, which, going all the way back to Bach and Mozart, they taught, they performed. So composers have pretty much always been, historically speaking, a multifaceted job. So part of the trajectory is that. You take on as many hats as you can and are able to take on. In terms of writing opera, a lot of that comes down to how much work do you care to take on without any concrete performance opportunities. So I don't know if I would really want to write another opera. I'm on the fence about whether I would write an opera without an actual commission or a very set performance engagement, because it is so much work, it is so time consuming. Even if I had a librettist, it would really detract from my ability to write other works where I might get additional performance opportunities. So I think it's a bit of a judgment call, person to person, composer to composer. In my case, if I can get the witnesses finished and give it some public airing, I'll be quite satisfied with that, because it is very, very challenging to get new operas performed and commissioned. It's a very, very competitive sphere, and like I said, there are structural and economic barriers around it. Groups like Scottish Opera, it's not that they don't entirely have an interest in it, it's just a great big risk, and it's a really complex situation. So getting people to take on new opera, it's not always a matter of will, but means and resources. So how much work do you want to put into something that really takes so much time and effort if there's not a guarantee of a performance when you could potentially do other stuff?
That's true. Well, I think we'll draw it to a close there. Can I just draw your attention to the next exchange talk, which is on Monday the 16th of October at 6 o'clock. It's a Zoom webinar, and the title is "What do you do with your legacy, and how do you best put it to use?" I almost think I should say that again, but I think you understand. So registration, there's a registration link available on the RCS Exchange Talk website, or you can see the e-flyer circulated to staff and students. Should we just say thank you to Jackie once more?